The Garithal Convocation Center sits on the third orbital platform above the gas giant Myron-Salus. If you've never been, I'll try to explain what it looks like. Imagine a structure that three different species designed simultaneously, none of them communicating, and somehow the result is beautiful. One wing curves upward like a cresting tide. Another descends in flat geometric shelves the way Threnke architecture always does, all right angles, all precision, no warmth. And then there's the central dome, which was added later by the Vossii, and it looks like something that simply decided to exist there one morning and nobody questioned it. The dome is translucent. From inside, you can see Myron-Salus rolling slowly below, its orange andrust cloud bands moving like slow breathing. It's distracting, honestly. Every session I've ever attended in that dome, I've caught at least 6 delegates staring downward instead of listening to whoever is speaking. I don't blame them. Myron-Salus is magnificent. But the day I'm describing, the gravity day, the professor day, the human day, the planet below was the last thing anyone was looking at. The convocation had been running for 4 days. This was the 5th morning. The full title of the event was the 63rd Galactic Academic Summit on Biological Limits and Species Endurance, which is exactly as dry as it sounds. I was not there as a participant. I was there as a documentation officer for the Kethful Diplomatic Bureau, which means my job was to sit in the back, take notes, and stay invisible. We do this at all major academic events because science, as it turns out, becomes policy faster than most politicians like to admit. What gets declared as biological fact in an auditorium on Monday tends to show up as a trade regulation by Thursday. So we watch, we document, we try to understand what is actually being established as truth before our lawmakers start building on top of it. The summit was attended by roughly 400 delegates representing 61 registered species. Biologists, xenophysiologists, gravitational endurance researchers, atmospheric adaptation specialists, you know the type. Brilliant mostly, insufferable occasionally. The way experts tend to be when they've spent 30 years in a field and have forgotten what it felt like not to know things. The keynote speaker for the 5th morning was Professor Drael Sarenveith. If you follow academic circles, and I realize most people don't, the name will mean something to you. Sarenveith is Threnke, old even by their standards, which means he had been alive long enough to have formed opinions that had calcified into something harder than opinions. He was one of the most cited researchers in xenogravitational biology. His paper on crush point thresholds across humanoid body types, the one that established the theoretical ceiling for unassisted gravitational tolerance, had been referenced in 1,700 subsequent studies. He walked to the podium that morning with the particular confidence of someone who has never really been challenged, not in any serious way, not in any way that left a mark. His presentation was called Gravitational Ceilings and the Immutable Physics of Biological Survival, a Cross-Species Analysis. I had read the abstract beforehand. Standard stuff mostly. A restatement of known principles, some new data on Verinal deep dwellers, a section on atmospheric pressure compensation. He was going to argue, as he had argued many times before, that 1G, the particular gravitational measurement of what most of the galaxy casually referred to as standard Earth gravity, represented a theoretical breaking point for any species not specifically evolved for it. The math, as far as it went, was solid. Most species in the galactic register find Earth gravity at least uncomfortable, and several find it genuinely dangerous. There are Pelosi-class species, the ones with hollow respiratory sacs, who start experiencing organ displacement above 0.7 G. There are Verinal whose cartilaginous internal frames compress dangerously above 0.85 G. There are the Turith, beautiful and thin as smoke, who simply cannot function above 0.6 G without mechanical support. So when Soren Vieth stood at the podium and began making the case that 1G gravity represented, and I'm quoting his own slide here, an empirical upper boundary for unassisted biological endurance among non-Earth adapted species, he was not wrong to say so. The problem, as it turned out, was the next part. The room was full. I was seated in the documentation row, a raised strip along the back wall, 3 seats wide, reserved for non-participant observers. Beside me was a colleague named Thress, from our Bureau's Xenobiology division, who spent most academic events quietly eating seed pods and muttering about people who misuse the word empirical. On my other side was an empty seat. It had been assigned to a delegate from the Marath Consortium who had apparently developed food poisoning from something in the station cafeteria and would not be attending. Below us, the 400 seats of the main floor were arranged in a shallow amphitheater shape. The podium was at the bottom. The holographic display behind Soren Vieth was enormous, 20 feet tall, crisp and blue-white, showing rotating anatomical models with gravitational stress indicators mapped in red. The human was in row 17. I noticed him early. Not because I was watching for him specifically, I hadn't known he would be there, but because humans are still unusual enough at major academic events that they register. The Galactic Register only formally acknowledged humanity 12 years ago. Humans had been known to us for longer than that, of course, but known and acknowledged are different things. The process of formal registration involves biological surveys, psychological profiling, environmental mapping, diplomatic review, the whole apparatus. Humanity passed, obviously, but the sense of them being new, being recent, still lingers in rooms like this. His name, I later found out, was Dr. Callum Marsh. He was 38 years old by human reckoning. A xenoenvironmental physiologist, which, in plain language, means he studied how biology responds to alien environments. He was representing the newly formed human academic delegation at his first galactic summit. He was sitting very quietly, arms folded on the desk in front of him, watching the podium. He looked like someone who was listening carefully, the specific way you listen when you're not sure whether you're going to agree. He had dark hair going slightly gray at the temples. He was wearing the standard delegate robe, which on most species hangs gracefully, and on humans tends to look like they put on a curtain. He didn't seem bothered by this. He had a small tablet on the desk in front of him. At some point during the presentation, I noticed him writing on it. Taking notes, I assumed. I was wrong about that too. Soren Vieth built his case methodically. That's what you have to understand about the man. He wasn't careless. He wasn't making sweeping claims without support. He walked through the data carefully, species by species, gravitational measurement by measurement, biological consequence by biological consequence. He showed the compression models. He showed the organ displacement charts. He showed the skeletal stress simulations for 15 different body types under various gravitational conditions. And then he said the sentence, the one that started everything. He said, again, I'm quoting directly from my documentation notes because I wrote it down the moment he said it. We can therefore state with confidence that one standard gravity, 1G, as measured on the human home world, represents not merely a challenge but a categorical biological ceiling. No species in the register, examined through the lens of comparative anatomy and confirmed physiological data, possesses unassisted tolerance at this level. The human species, which evolved under these conditions, represents an evolutionary anomaly, not a model. They are the exception that proves the rule, and the rule is this: 1G gravity, by every known biological measurement, should crush the life out of anything walking through it. There was a murmur through the room, polite. The kind of murmur that means yes, we agree rather than we disagree. Delegates were nodding. I saw Thress write something in her own notes. The Veronal contingent, 4 of them seated together in row 4, were making the soft clicking sound their species produces when processing information that confirms what they already suspected. Sarenviath moved to his next slide. And that's when Dr. Callum Marsh raised his hand. This seems like a simple thing, a hand raised, a request to speak. But I want you to understand the social architecture of a moment like that. In the galactic academic tradition, which has been running for over 2,000 years, you do not interrupt a keynote address. You do not raise your hand during the core thesis presentation. There is a question period, formally scheduled, and that is when questions happen. Raising your hand during the address itself is, depending on your species, somewhere between mildly impolite and deeply offensive. Most species present would have understood this. The Threnki regard it as a disruption. The Vasii treat it as a form of aggression. Even the more informal species, the Pelosi, the Marathi, generally follow the form. Dr. Callum Marsh was 12 years new to this tradition. His hand went up. Sarenviath paused. He looked at the human the way you look at something that has appeared in a place where it shouldn't be. Not angry exactly, more recalibrating. The room went very quiet. The summit moderator, a Vasii named Rel Thassin, smooth-faced and impeccably composed, leaned slightly forward in her seat at the side table. She was clearly calculating whether to intervene. Sarenviath said, and I could hear the careful patience in his voice, "We will have a question period following the conclusion of the address." Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. He lowered his hand. He picked up his tablet. He continued writing. And somehow that was worse, because now everyone in the room was watching him write and wondering what he was writing, and the question he hadn't asked was sitting in the air like a held breath. Sarenviath continued the presentation. He covered the final 3 sections: atmospheric interaction, long-term structural degradation under sustained 1G exposure, and something called the evolutionary isolation principle, which was his argument that humanity's adaptation to 1G was not evidence that other species could achieve the same, but rather evidence that Earth's particular evolutionary pressure had produced a singular and unrepeatable biological outcome. The phrase he used, and which showed up on the slide in large blue letters, was unique, non-transferable, non-comparable. He was talking about humans, the way you'd talk about an interesting fossil. In the documentation row, I glanced at Thress. She was eating a seed pod and looking at the ceiling. Below us in row 17, Dr. Marsh was still writing. The address concluded to sustain polite applause, the real kind, not the perfunctory kind, because whatever else Sarenviath was, his presentation was thorough and clearly argued. He took a small bow and stepped to the side of the podium. Moderator Rel Thassin stood. "We will now open the floor to questions. Registered delegates who wish to pose a question should." Dr. Marsh's hand was already up. It had gone up before she finished the sentence. There was a small sound from the Threnki section, not quite a gasp, more like the collective intake of air from people who are about to observe something that could be uncomfortable. Rel Thassin looked at Dr. Marsh for a moment. Then, with the practiced neutrality of a very good moderator, she said, "The delegate from the human academic delegation." Dr. Marsh stood. He was not tall by human standards, from what I understand. Maybe average. He didn't look like someone about to ignite a room. He looked like someone who had thought of something and wanted to say it. He looked at Sarenviath. And he said, in that quiet, almost conversational way that I later replayed in my memory many, many times, "Professor, with the greatest respect, if 1G gravity should, by your models, crush the life out of anything walking through it, then why am I not crushed?" The silence that followed was not a polite silence. It was the silence of 400 people processing something simultaneously. Sarenviath blinked, once, twice. His facial plates, the Threnke equivalent of an expression, shifted in a way I'd never seen before. Not anger, not confusion exactly, more like someone who has just reached for a railing that isn't there. He said, "That is the point of the anomaly argument. You are the exception." "I don't feel like an exception," Dr. Marsh said. "I feel like a person standing in 0.98 g right now, close enough to home gravity that I barely notice, and by your models, I shouldn't be standing at all." "The models account for." "Do they?" Dr. Marsh picked up his tablet. He held it up. "I've been going through your stress simulation parameters while you were presenting. The Tyron compression model you cited, the one that says humanoid structures fail above 0.9 g, it uses a baseline skeletal density of 1.2 grams per cubic centimeter. Do you know what human cortical bone density averages?" Sorenvieth said nothing. 1.85 grams per cubic centimeter, Dr. Marsh said. On the low end, higher in load-bearing regions. We've had bones that thick since before we had cities. Our body evolved under 1G, Professor, which means our bones aren't fighting the gravity. They're built for it. They're calibrated to it. Our cardiovascular system runs at pressures that would be considered pathological in most register species, because we need that pressure to push blood upward against a gravity well this strong. Our muscle-to-weight ratios are optimized for it. Our inner ear, our proprioceptive system, our pain tolerance, our tissue repair rate, all of it evolved specifically to function in conditions your model says are unsurvivable. He lowered the tablet. "I'm not an exception, Professor. I'm an example. The question isn't why I can survive 1G, it's why your models forgot to check what we're made of before deciding we couldn't." I need to try to describe the room at this point, because there was something happening that my documentation notes capture in outline but don't really convey. The Threnke contingent, Sorenvieth's own academic tradition, had gone very still. When Threnke goes still, it means something. They're not a species that goes quiet out of discomfort. They go quiet when something has reorganized their understanding of a situation, when the information around them requires new processing. The Varanul in row 4 had stopped their clicking. All 4 of them were leaning forward very slightly. The Pelosi contingent was doing something with their upper membrane folds that I recognized as agitation. Not hostile agitation, more like the specific agitation of people who are realizing they might have been wrong about something they've casually assumed for a long time. Moderator Relthasine had sat back down. She appeared to have decided that what was happening was not, technically, a rules violation. It was a question after all. An extended one, but a question. Thress, beside me, had put down her seed pod. She was watching Dr. Marsh with an expression I hadn't seen her wear before. Sorenvieth recovered. He was, as I said, brilliant, and brilliant people recover faster than most. "Dr. Marsh," he said, and there was only a small tightness in his voice, "your points about bone density are noted, but they do not address the fundamental thesis. The argument is not that humans cannot survive 1G, obviously you do, as you're standing before us. The argument is that 1G represents an upper ceiling for species that have not undergone this specific evolutionary pressure. The data on non-Earth evolved species. The data on non-Earth evolved species was gathered under conditions of short exposure," Dr. Marsh said. "Right." A pause. "Largely, yes. Extended exposure presents obvious ethical and practical challenges. So what we know is that most register species find 1G uncomfortable or harmful over short periods. What we don't know, because the studies haven't been run, is what happens under gradual, controlled, extended acclimation. We don't know if the body adapts. We don't know if targeted conditioning changes the threshold. We don't know because we haven't looked. Biological limits are. Biological limits are what we find when we go looking for them properly, Dr. Marsh said. Until then, they're estimates, very good estimates in some cases, but estimates. Another pause, longer this time. Furthermore, Dr. Marsh continued, and here he glanced down at his tablet again, then back up. Your evolutionary isolation principle, the idea that Earth's 1G adaptation is non-transferable, I'd like to push back on that too, if that's all right. Relthasine from the side table murmured, the delegate may continue. The principle assumes that adaptation is species-specific and environmentally determined exclusively through evolutionary timescale. But we know from 70 years of human spacefaring, our own spacefaring, before galactic registration, that the human body is genuinely plastic in ways that surprised even our own researchers. Bone density shifts in low-gravity environments within months. Muscle mass reconfigures. Cardiovascular pressure recalibrates. These are not evolutionary changes. They happen in individual lifetimes, which suggests that the relationship between biology and gravity is more dynamic than a fixed ceiling model accounts for. He set the tablet down on his desk. I'm not saying your core finding is wrong, Professor. I'm saying the frame is too small. You've studied the ceiling from below. I'm suggesting you try measuring from inside it. There was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, where nobody in the room made a sound. Then the Vasii ambassador, who was seated in the second row and had, from what I could tell, been asleep for most of the presentation, sat up very straight and said something in Vasii that the translation feed rendered as, "The new ones have sharp edges." And then the room erupted. Not in conflict, in conversation. The kind of immediate, overlapping, everyone talking at once energy that only happens in academic settings when something has cracked the surface of a consensus, and the underneath is more complicated than people expected. Here is what happened in the 30 minutes that followed. 3 separate Threnke researchers left their seats and walked to the front of the room to examine Soren Vieth's data slides directly. I watched them cluster around the gravitational stress parameters, their head plates moving in the way that means intensive cognitive processing. A Pelosi xenobiologist named Threshinara, one of the most published researchers in comparative respiratory biology, walked over to row 17 and sat down in the empty seat next to Dr. Marsh. She did not ask permission. She sat down and immediately started showing him something on her own tablet, and he leaned over to look, and they began what appeared to be a very intense, very rapid conversation that neither of them seemed inclined to slow down. The Varinol in row 4 had activated a shared holographic model between them. I could see it from the documentation row, a faint blue structure hanging in the air above their table, and they were running something through it. Running something through it with what I can only describe as urgency. Soren Vieth was still at the podium. He was no longer presenting. He was standing there with a very particular expression. The expression of a person who has just realized that the ground they were standing on is not as solid as it felt this morning, and they are deciding whether to be angry about that or whether to get curious about it instead. It took him maybe a minute and a half. And then, and I want to be clear that this is not something I expected, he walked off the podium and crossed the room to row 17. He sat down on the other side of Dr. Marsh. I watched Soren Vieth and Marsh look at each other for a moment. The professor's face did the thing Threnke faces do when they are performing a significant recalibration. The human just looked at him steadily. Calm, not triumphant, just waiting. Then Soren Vieth said something I couldn't hear from the documentation row. Dr. Marsh said something back. And then Soren Vieth pulled out his own data pad and showed Marsh something, and Dr. Marsh nodded slowly, and the two of them bent over the pad together. Moderator Relthasine looked at the erupting room for a moment. Then she announced a 30-minute break, closed her folder, and went to get a drink of water. Build the weight of a shifting room. I came down from the documentation row during the break. This is technically against Bureau protocol. Documentation officers are supposed to remain in position. But Thress was watching my post, she said. Go. I'll write it up as a structural assessment walk, and I needed to understand what was happening on the floor. The room was extraordinary. Groups had formed organically, the way they do when something real is being worked out. Not the polite, orchestrated networking of conference breaks, the real kind, where people grab each other's arms and say, wait, look at this, and everyone forgets what species they are for a minute because the data in front of them is more interesting. I moved toward the front of the room. 3 different conversations caught fragments of my attention. A Kethful biologist I recognized from our academy, Dr. Senarath, a quiet woman who has spent 40 years studying muscle fiber composition, was standing near the window overlooking Myron Salus, talking to a human I didn't recognize. She was doing the thing she does when she's excited. Her secondary hand gestures were going, which she usually suppresses in public. She was saying, but the load-bearing distribution, you're telling me the femur is doing the primary work, not the spinal column. That's. And the human was nodding. Yeah, the spine's more of a shock absorber in our case. And Senarath made a sound that I think was the Kethful equivalent of fascinating. Near the data display, 2 Threnke researchers were having what appeared to be an argument. Threnke arguments look like 2 people having a staring contest while speaking very rapidly. I caught the skeletal density variable was never corrected for, and Sorenvieth's model assumes biological ceilings function independently of, and 1,700 citations, and none of them checked the input parameters. Row 17 had become something like a small seminar. Dr. Marsh was still in his seat. Sorenvieth was still beside him. The Pelosi xenobiologist Threshinara was on the other side. 2 Veronal had come over. A young Vasii researcher, she looked barely out of her graduate program, was standing at the end of the row, clearly wanting to join but not sure if there was space. Dr. Marsh noticed her. He made a gesture, a human gesture beckoning, come here, and the young Vasii researcher blinked, then moved forward and found a seat. I got close enough to hear fragments of what was being said. Sorenvieth, the compression model assumes uniform distribution, but you're saying the human muscular system is actively compensating. Dr. Marsh, continuously. It's not passive tolerance, it's active management. Our muscles are in constant low-level engagement against the gravity. That's why humans in low-G environments develop muscle atrophy faster than expected. The body was designed to fight the pull. Take away the pull and the system doesn't know what to do with itself. Threshinara. This is consistent with what we've observed in Pelosi exposed to higher G environments. The musculature response is never purely structural. Dr. Marsh, right, the biology is dynamic. The ceiling isn't a fixed point, it's a process. Sorenvieth, and here his voice had changed. It was quieter, more careful. I want to see the bone density studies, the raw data, not the meta-analysis summaries. Dr. Marsh pulled up something on his tablet and handed it to Sorenvieth. The professor took it, looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, these numbers weren't in the Galactic Register intake survey. No, Dr. Marsh said, a lot of things weren't. The intake survey is designed to establish minimum thresholds for classification. It doesn't go looking for capacities. Sorenvieth looked up. He looked at Dr. Marsh with an expression I did not have a name for. We have been studying you the wrong way, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't really an apology either. It was more like a man saying aloud something he had just, in that moment, understood. Dr. Marsh nodded, not in triumph, just in agreement. Yeah, he said, you have been. The break extended to 45 minutes because nobody wanted to stop the conversations happening on the floor. When Relthasine finally called the room back to order, she looked out at the delegates, many of whom were still mid-sentence, and waited for the room to settle. Then she said, with the remarkable composure of a professional who has seen unexpected things before, "In light of the discussions prompted by Dr. Marsh's questions, the academic committee has agreed to extend this morning's session by 2 hours and open the floor for a structured panel response. Professor Sorenvieth has graciously agreed to participate as a responding discussant. Dr. Marsh, are you willing to take the floor?" Dr. Marsh looked mildly surprised, like someone who had raised their hand to ask one question and had somehow ended up being asked to teach the class. He said, "I'll do my best." Climax the 2-hour session. What happened over the next 2 hours is difficult to render as narrative because it was simultaneously too dense and too wide-ranging to compress cleanly. It was a scientific conversation, and scientific conversations don't have the same shape as stories. They spiral, they double back, they go sideways and then suddenly return to the center with something nobody expected. But I'll try to give you the core of it. Dr. Marsh did not have a presentation prepared. He had his tablet, his notes from the morning, and his training. He stood at the podium. He had to adjust the height because it had been calibrated for Sorenvieth, who is taller, and he spoke for 20 minutes without slides about what he called the measurement problem. The measurement problem, as he described it, was this: when the galactic community had begun cataloging species for biological comparison, they had used a framework designed around vulnerability. What can each species not do? What environments are dangerous for each species? What are the minimum conditions for survival? This framework made sense for safety and ethics. You need to know what harms beings before you can protect them. But it meant that the entire database of cross-species biology was organized around limits and fragility rather than capacities and strengths. When researchers then used that database to build comparative models, like Sorenvieth's ceiling model, they were building on a foundation that had only ever looked at biology from the direction of harm. The model told you, Dr. Marsh said, that 1G should crush most species. It's probably right about that. But when it came to humans, it assumed our survival was the anomaly, the weird exception that didn't need explaining. It never asked, what is this biology actually doing? What has it been shaped to do? He paused. We are not an exception to your model. We are a data point your model never collected. There was a long silence. Then a Kethvil researcher in row 8, I didn't catch his name, said, "How long can a human sustain full gravitational load? I mean physically. Endurance." Dr. Marsh looked at him. "What do you mean by full gravitational load?" "Running, carrying weight, physical exertion, under 1G. Humans historically, before space travel, before modern technology, could run for several hours continuously under 1G, not fast, over distance, but sustained. There are accounts of humans running down prey animals through sheer persistence. The animal would exhaust itself trying to escape. The human would just keep following." A silence. "For how long?" the Kethvil researcher asked. "Hours," Dr. Marsh said. "Sometimes the better part of a day." The silence in the room had a different texture now. It wasn't the silence of discomfort or challenge. It was the silence of genuinely new information landing in a space not quite prepared for it. The Vossii ambassador, who was no longer by any measure asleep, said, "Your species hunted by exhaustion." "Persistence hunting," Dr. Marsh said. "Yes. It's one of the older theories about how we evolved our cardiovascular endurance. Whether it's the whole story, I don't know, but the capacity is real." The conversation moved from there into territory that I found increasingly difficult to follow from a technical standpoint: bone remodeling rates, cardiovascular pressure tolerances, tissue oxygenation at elevated gravitational loads. But I'll describe the shape of it rather than the specifics. What emerged over those 2 hours was something like a collaborative reassessment. Sorenvieth participated actively. He was not a man who'd been defeated. He was a man who'd been given better data, and he was using it. There's a particular kind of scientific integrity that doesn't require the person who was wrong to be humiliated, and Soren Vieth had it. He asked questions. He challenged points where he thought they needed challenging. He pushed Dr. Marsh on the acclimation data. These are short-term studies. The long-term picture is incomplete, and Dr. Marsh agreed with him. You're right. The long-term picture is incomplete, which is an argument for more research, not for declaring the ceiling fixed. That exchange, actually, might have been the most important moment of the 2 hours. Not the clash, the agreement. Two researchers from species who had met less than 12 years ago, standing in a room above a gas giant, and agreeing that the answer to insufficient data was more data, not premature conclusions. The young Vossii researcher who had joined the Row 17 seminar during the break, her name was Vel Rassin, I found out later, a second-year doctoral student in xenophysiology, asked a question during the open discussion period that stilled the room. She said, Dr. Marsh, are you the strongest species in the register by the data we've been discussing? Dr. Marsh looked at her for a moment. He seemed to be deciding how to answer carefully. He said, I don't know. I think that's the wrong question, honestly. Strongest in which dimension? Under which conditions? The Varanol can survive pressure differentials that would kill me instantly. The Turith can process atmospheric compositions that would be toxic to me in minutes. Every species in this room is extraordinary under the right conditions. What I'm saying is that humans are extraordinary under conditions that most of the galaxy casually assumes we'd fail under. We've been put in the wrong category. Vel Rassin nodded slowly. The anomaly category, she said. The exception category, he said. Yeah, which I get. We're new to the register. We came in undocumented. The intake survey didn't look deep enough. I understand why the picture got painted that way. I just want to correct it. Another pause. Not because it matters for ego, he added. Because it matters for how we work together. If you think I'm fragile, you'll assign me roles that protect me instead of roles where I'm useful. And I don't think any of us want that. The Threnke researcher who had been conducting the staring contest argument near the data display earlier walked to the microphone during the open session. His name was Dr. Vieth Sorenkiel, and unlike Soren Vieth, he was younger, maybe mid-career by Threnke standards, and he had the energy of someone who has been wanting to say something for a while and has finally found the moment. He said, I want to be direct. Our field has been operating on incomplete models. Not wrong models, exactly. The vulnerability data is real and important, but incomplete. And the reason they're incomplete is that when the human species entered our dataset 12 years ago, we filed them under exceptional and moved on. We didn't investigate. We assumed the exception proved the rule, and we didn't ask what the exception was trying to tell us. He looked at Dr. Marsh. That was a methodological failure. It was also, I think it's worth naming, a failure of intellectual humility. We have been the galactic community for several thousand years. We have our frameworks. We have our consensus. A new species arrives, and we slot them into our existing framework instead of asking whether the framework needs adjustment. He sat down. The room was quiet. Dr. Marsh said, for what it's worth, we've done the same thing to ourselves. We had our own model of what biology could do, and then we went to space and the model kept being wrong. Our bodies did things we didn't expect in low gravity. They adapted in ways our original models didn't predict. Science revising itself isn't a failure. It's just science. At the end of the 2 hours, Rel Thassin called the session closed. The formal recommendation from the academic committee, delivered as a procedural note at the end, was as follows: that the summit would commission a working group to review the cross-species biological ceiling models with particular attention to human physiological data, that this working group would include Dr. Marsh as a primary contributor, and that the results would be presented at the 64th summit. Professor Soren Vieth seconded the recommendation. I wrote that down. I underlined it twice. Resolution: what the room felt like after. I've attended 43 galactic academic summits over my career. I've documented proceedings ranging from genuinely groundbreaking to genuinely tedious. I've watched discoveries happen, and I've watched consensus calcify, and I've watched the same arguments get made in slightly different language by slightly different researchers every few years. I've never seen a room change the way that room changed that day. Not in the dramatic sense, nobody cried, nobody shouted, nothing broke, but there was something different about the air by the time the session closed, something lighter, or maybe not lighter, more honest, like a pressure had been released that people hadn't quite known was there. The conversations during the final break before the afternoon sessions were different from the ones before, more careful, more open. I heard, several times, variants of the phrase "I assumed," followed by a correction, which is not a common phrase in academic settings, where people generally work hard to sound like they've already known everything they currently know. I found Thress in the documentation row. She was looking at her seed pod, which she hadn't finished. She said, without looking up, "I've been writing comparative biological profiles for 11 years. I said, "I know." She said, "I've been using the Soren-Vieth ceiling model in half of them." I said, "I know." She said, "I need to go back through the human section." I said, "I think a lot of people will be doing that." She put the seed pod down. She picked up her tablet. She said, "He didn't even seem angry about it." I said, "No, he didn't. He just asked the question. Just the one question." She looked at her tablet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think they know, the humans? Do you think they know how much they've been underestimated?" I thought about it. I thought about Dr. Callum Marsh sitting in row 17, writing on his tablet while Soren-Vieth told the room that 1G gravity should crush the life out of anything walking through it. Writing carefully and calmly and waiting for the question period. I thought about the way he'd asked the question, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a genuine inquiry. Then why am I not crushed? Like he was honestly curious about the gap between what the model said and what he knew about himself. I thought about the 45-minute break where he'd sat in row 17 and talked to every researcher who came to him, sharing data freely, asking questions back, not keeping score. I said, "I think some of them do, and I think it doesn't make them angry. I think it makes them patient." Thress thought about this for a moment. She said, "That might be the most alarming thing you've said all week." I went back to my documentation. I wrote the formal report, which runs to 47 pages and is, I think, a reasonably accurate account of what happened that day in procedural terms. But when I got home, I wrote something else, not for the Bureau, just for me. I wrote, "The model was wrong because it started from the wrong place. It started from the idea that 1G is a ceiling. It didn't consider that, for one species, it might be the floor, the thing they built themselves up from, the pressure that made them what they are. We have been studying their limits. We should have been studying their foundations." Final build, what I learned later. I looked up Dr. Callum Marsh afterward. He wasn't hard to find. After the 63rd summit, his name became considerably more prominent in xenophysiology circles. Before the summit, he had been a relatively quiet figure. Solid credentials, a doctorate from what humans call MIT, a postdoctoral fellowship studying human cardiovascular adaptation in low-G environments, 7 papers published in minor to mid-tier journals. He wasn't a star. He was one of the competent, careful researchers that every field is full of and doesn't always notice. After the summit, he led the working group that revised the cross-species biological ceiling models. The revised framework, published the following year and called, straightforwardly, the Marsh-Soren-Vieth Adaptive Threshold Model, became foundational in the field. It's the one that replaced the fixed ceiling approach with a dynamic range approach. Instead of mapping species against a single threshold, it mapped them against a range of conditions accounting for adaptation plasticity, evolutionary context, and individual variation. The paper has, as of my last check, accumulated more than 9,000 citations. Saranviath co-authored it. He wrote the foreword, which I've read several times because it's remarkable in its honesty. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, that the best thing that can happen to a scientific model is to have someone stand inside it and ask the obvious question. He doesn't name Dr. Marsh directly in the foreword. He doesn't have to. I looked up one other thing. The question period for the 63rd Summit's keynote address officially began at 10:42 Standard Time. Dr. Callum Marsh's hand went up at 10:42 and 4 seconds. He had been waiting, tablet in hand, notes ready, for the exact moment he was allowed to speak. He had not been impatient. He had not pushed before the right moment. He had sat there under the same gravitational conditions that the professor's model said should be crushing him, and he had waited, and he had written, and when the moment came, he had asked his question quietly and clearly and without drama. I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. Ending line. They've been getting that question wrong for 12 years, wrong about what we're made of, wrong about what we can carry, wrong about what we've built ourselves to survive. Dr. Callum Marsh didn't correct them with anger. He didn't wave a flag or pound a table or make them feel small. He just stood up, under the weight they said should kill him, and asked one quiet question. And the whole room shifted. Because that's the thing about a species that evolved under 1g gravity. They know how to hold weight. They've been doing it since before they had words for it. End of Part 1. Part 2, The Working Group. Hook 0, 00 to 030. 8 months after the summit, I received an assignment I had not asked for. The Kethville Diplomatic Bureau has a practice of embedding documentation officers in significant collaborative research initiatives. The logic is straightforward. Research becomes policy. Policy shapes interspecies relations. Interspecies relations are what the Bureau exists to manage. So we send people to watch the science happen and write down what they see, because the official papers that eventually get published leave out most of the interesting parts. I was assigned to the Marsh-Saranviath Working Group. I was not entirely sure how to feel about this. I had watched the summit session from the documentation row, neutral and removed, and it had been one of the most affecting things I had encountered in my professional life. That was supposed to be the end of it. A data point in my files, a memory I'd carry, a story I'd probably tell at some point to someone who'd never quite believe how quiet the human had been. But the Bureau decided I should continue, perhaps because I already knew the context, perhaps because there was no one else available, perhaps because someone in the upper structure thought that whatever was beginning in this working group was worth watching closely. So 8 months after the summit, I boarded a transport to the Pelion research platform, a small, efficient orbital station near the Reth system, chosen because it was roughly equidistant from the home worlds of most working group members, and because it had an exceptional library and very good coffee, which turned out to matter more than anyone officially admitted. Set up the Pelion platform in the group. The Pelion research platform is nothing like the Garethal Convocation Center, where the Convocation Center is designed to impress. Its translucent dome, its architectural collaboration, its view of Myron Salu's Pelion is designed to function. It is a rectangle with corridors. The research rooms are clean and well-equipped and deeply boring to look at. The sleeping quarters are small but private. The common areas are comfortable in an unpretentious way. There is a wall of windows in the main common room that looks out onto open space, which sounds dramatic until you've seen it 600 times, at which point it becomes background. What makes Pelion good is its silence. It is quiet in a way that few research stations manage. The ventilation system is designed to be inaudible. The walls are thick. There are protocols against loud noise in the corridors after the midday meal. I have never slept as well anywhere as I slept at Pelion, which seems like it should be a small thing, but over the course of a long research stint becomes enormously significant. The working group had 14 members. 10 researchers from 8 species, plus Dr. Marsh and a second human physiologist named Dr. Anara Bhatt. Then Soren Vieth, who had come despite being, as he put it during the first group dinner, at an age where orbital travel is annoying but intellectual honesty is non-negotiable. And me, in the corner taking notes. The first formal session of the working group took place on the 3rd day of the residency. The first 2 days were what I can only describe as careful orientation, people learning how each other worked, how each other communicated, where the bones of past assumptions lay buried in the vocabulary everyone used. That sounds abstract. Let me give you a concrete example. On the second afternoon, the group was doing what they called a baseline review, going through the existing data, species by species, building a shared starting point. Soren Vieth was presenting the Varinol data, which he knew well, and one of the Varinol researchers in the group, Dr. Sarvel, a meticulous person who documented everything twice and apologized for nothing, stopped him mid-sentence. She said, "You said fragile infrastructure. What does that mean?" Soren Vieth said, "It's a standard descriptor. The Varinol internal frame is cartilaginous," she said. "Yes, but fragile compared to what? Your descriptor assumes a calcified bone baseline. My infrastructure is not fragile, it is flexible. These are different things." Soren Vieth looked at her. He said, "You're right. I'll revise the descriptor." Dr. Sarvel nodded once and said nothing more about it. But the conversation had shifted something. Everyone in the room was now thinking about the baseline assumptions in their own vocabulary. Dr. Marsh, I noticed, had opened his tablet and was writing. Later, during the break, I overheard him talking to Dr. Bhatt. He said, "How much of the existing data do you think is contaminated by framing?" Dr. Bhatt, a tall woman with an extremely precise way of speaking, as if every sentence had been edited before it left her mouth, said, "A significant portion. The framing comes from whoever designed the collection instrument. In most cases, that was a species with a calcified bone morphology working from within their own experience of what a body is." "So the data isn't wrong exactly," Dr. Marsh said. "It's just describing itself." "Almost all data is describing itself," Dr. Bhatt said. "The question is whether the researcher knows that." The working group organized itself around 4 research threads. I'll describe them briefly because understanding what they were working on matters for understanding what happened later. Thread 1, the baseline problem. This was the vocabulary and framing work, going through the existing cross-species biological database and auditing the language used to describe each species' capabilities, looking for assumptions baked into the descriptors. Soren Vieth led this thread. It was, everyone agreed, the most tedious and the most necessary. Thread 2, adaptive plasticity. The research thread examining how bodies change in response to environmental conditions, not over evolutionary time, but within individual lifetimes. Dr. Marsh and Threshinara, the Pelosi xenobiologist who had joined him in row 17 at the summit, co-led this thread. It was the thread most directly connected to what Dr. Marsh had argued in that room above Myron Salu's. Thread 3, comparative load management. How do different species actually handle gravitational load? Not theoretically, observationally. What happens in the body, species by species, under varying gravitational conditions, when measured by the same instruments using the same standards? Dr. Sarvel led this one. with the very deliberate intention of building a framework that didn't start from assumptions. Thread 4. The capacity framework. The new model. What would a biological comparison system look like if it was organized around what species can do rather than what harms them? This was the integrating thread. It couldn't really begin until the others had produced something, but the conceptual scaffolding was being built in parallel. I attended the sessions for all 4 threads, rotating through them. My notes from this period run to several hundred pages and contain more xenobiology than I ever expected to understand. I don't claim to have grasped all of it, but I understood enough to watch what was happening. Build what emerged over weeks. The adaptive plasticity thread produced its first significant finding in the 3rd week. Dr. Marsh and Threshinara had been running a comparative analysis of adaptation timelines, how quickly different species bodies respond to environmental pressure changes, and what structural changes occur. The existing data was patchy, but there was enough to build from. What they found was this. The human body's adaptation rate to gravitational changes was, by the available data, notably faster than predicted by standard biological models. When humans were moved from 1G to lower gravity environments, the documented rate of muscular and skeletal adjustment, recalibration, essentially, as the body figured out it didn't need to work as hard, was approximately twice the rate seen in comparable body-type species. Conversely, when humans from low-G environments were returned to 1G, the readaptation was faster than the initial adaptation. The body, apparently, recognized home. Dr. Marsh presented this finding to the full group in a session I watched from my corner. He was careful about it. He qualified the data limitations, named the gaps, avoided overclaiming, but the core finding was solid. What surprised people was what he said at the end. He said, "The interesting thing isn't the rate. The interesting thing is what it implies about how the human body experiences gravity. It doesn't seem to treat 1G as a maximum stress condition. It treats it as a reference point. The body's behavior under varying gravity looks less like stretching to a limit and more like adjusting around a center." Dr. Sarvell said, "The body knows where home is." Dr. Marsh looked at her. "That's a more elegant way to put it than anything I wrote." She made the Varinal gesture for "you're welcome," a very slight lowering of the upper body, and wrote something in her own notes. The baseline problem thread produced something unexpected in week 4. Soren Vieth's team had been going through the descriptors in the biological database, cataloging where the language of vulnerability dominated. It was painstaking work, thousands of entries, many of them containing the same assumptions in slightly different words. But in week 4, they turned to the human entries. And they found something that nobody, apparently, had noticed before. The human entries in the Galactic Register's biological database were the shortest entries by significant margin. On average, the human entry for any given biological parameter was about 40% the length of the average entry for other species. The data present was accurate as far as anyone could check. But the gaps, the missing parameters, the uncollected measurements, the assessments that had never been done were enormous. It wasn't that humans had been described wrong. It was that they'd barely been described. Soren Vieth brought this to the full group. He had a display showing the relative completeness of entries across the 61 registered species. The human column was a fraction of the others. He said, in the measured way he had when he was saying something significant, "We registered humanity 12 years ago. We asked what we needed to ask to confirm they met the minimum criteria, and then we filed them and moved on. We have less biological data on humans in the Galactic Register than we have on any other registered species, including species we encountered less than 5 years ago." A silence. Dr. Bat said, without particular emphasis, "Because the survey was designed to confirm, not to understand." "Yes," Soren Vieth said. Dr. Marsh was looking at the display. He said, "Can I ask something?" Saranviath looked at him. The intake survey for human registration, when it was run, the humans who participated, were they told what was being measured, what the purpose was? Saranviath thought about this. I believe the standard protocol involves explaining that it's a biological capability assessment for registration purposes. But not what the thresholds were, not what would constitute a pass versus a concern. No, that's not typically disclosed. Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. So the humans taking the survey didn't know what you were looking for. Correct. And the people running the survey weren't looking for capacity. They were looking for minimum viability. That is the purpose of the intake survey, yes. Dr. Marsh said. Then the survey found what it was looking for and stopped. The humans taking it answered the questions asked and didn't volunteer what wasn't asked for. Another silence. Dr. Bat said, "We do not, as a species, typically announce our capabilities to strangers." The ghost of a smile crossed Saranviath's face. A reasonable approach from an evolutionary standpoint. "We've had some experience with being the newest species in a room," Dr. Marsh said. "The third week of the 5th month, roughly the midpoint of the working group residency. Something happened that I want to describe carefully, because it's the moment I keep returning to when I think about what the working group was really about." The comparative load management thread had been building its observational protocol for weeks. Dr. Sarvel's approach was meticulous to the point of being almost philosophical. She wanted to ensure that the instruments were calibrated to each species' morphology rather than to a universal standard, because a universal standard, she argued, was just another way of making one species experience the default. When they finally ran the first round of actual measurements, physical load tests, gravitational endurance assessments, the real-world data collection that the thread existed to produce, the results were, in Dr. Sarvel's careful phrasing, not what the existing models predicted. What they found, consistently, across every species in the group who volunteered for measurement, was that the gap between theoretical limit and actual performance was almost universally larger than the models suggested. Not hugely. The models weren't wildly wrong. But consistently, measurably, every species in the room performed somewhat better than the existing data said they should. Dr. Sarvel's interpretation. The data was collected under conditions of stress, uncertainty, and short exposure. Bodies under those conditions perform at diminished capacity. We've been building models from stress condition performance data and treating it as a biological ceiling. Dr. Marsh's interpretation, offered during the same session, we were all measured scared. The results reflected that. And then, and this is the moment, Dr. Marsh volunteered for the 1G assessment. The platform operated at 0.7G, a compromise between the comfort requirements of different species in the group. The 1G test environment was a dedicated room with enhanced gravitational plating. Going in there was uncomfortable for most species present, and the protocol was strictly voluntary. Dr. Marsh walked into the room. The rest of the group watched from outside, through the observation window. The assessment ran for 40 minutes. It involved sustained physical load-bearing, movement at speed, cognitive task completion under gravitational pressure, and endurance measurement. I watched from the documentation corner. Dr. Marsh did not look like he was performing. He looked like he was doing something moderately familiar. He moved carefully at first. You could see him calibrating, the way you do when you return to a known environment after time away. And then, as the test progressed, something settled. His posture adjusted. The slightly increased effort that had been visible in the first 10 minutes smoothed out. By the end of the 40 minutes, he looked less tired than I had expected. Dr. Sarvel ran the numbers from outside. She was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, The performance data will need to be reviewed carefully, but at preliminary assessment, the results are approximately in line with what a calibrated model of 1G adapted biology would predict. Someone in the group, I didn't catch who, said, which means the previous model wasn't calibrated. No, she said, it was not. Dr. Marsh came out of the assessment room. Someone Threshinara, I think, handed him water. He drank it. He looked at the group through the window and said, how'd it look? Soren Vieth said, from the back of the observation room, with the slightly rueful precision that had become his particular way of engaging with inconvenient truths. It looked like a species that belongs in 1G, Dr. Marsh.